Greetings, and welcome to the Yale Classics Department first ever podcast. The subject of today's broadcast is the first women to receive PhDs in classics from Yale between the years of 1895 and 1933. This podcast was made possible by the generous support of the WFF and GSAS Gender and Diversity Fellowship, which enabled me to conduct archival research on this extraordinary group of women over the course of the past year. In Section 1, I will sketch in broad strokes the historical context in which these women entered the field of classics. In Section 2, I will explain how this context shaped the various ends to which they deployed their classical learning, all of which have a distinctly activist character. I will conclude in Section 3 by describing briefly the demography of the women in my study. The history of classical education in the 19th century United States may be characterized by a tragic irony of sorts. By the turn of the century, the educational opportunities available to women in the discipline of classics had finally begun to rival those available to men. The most dramatic increase in women's knowledge of the classical past occurred in the decades following the Civil War, when women's colleges and coeducational institutions such as Cornell University, the University of Michigan, and Bryn Mawr College began to import the classical curricula used by men's colleges. The rise of the Greek play on college campuses, where by 1910 women constituted 40% of the student body, neatly demonstrates this educational parity. By reciting in a language long regarded as the apex of male erudition, college-educated women in the United States constituted themselves as the intellectual equals of their male counterparts. Indeed, one of the classicists in this study, Phillipa McCarthy, a 1929 alumna of the Yale Classics Department and the Ellen A. Kendall Professor of Greek at Wellesley, was well known about campus for her productions of Aristophanes' Frogs, which she staged in the Wellesley swimming pool. One of her students, Mary Lefkowitz, Professor Emerita of Classical Studies at Wellesley College, recounts that she regularly assumed the role of Euripides' landlady, intoning her Greek lines in a strong Irish accent. It must be emphasized, however, that women gained access to high-caliber training in the classics just as classical texts began to be construed less as vehicles for public action, as they had been in the 18th century, than as emotionally charged works of literature to be read for the cultivation of the self. Gone were the days of the classically educated gentleman statesman of the mold of John Quincy Adams, who spent 2 hours every day for 10 months reading in Latin the complete works of Cicero. By the end of the 19th century, the natural and social sciences had roundly displaced classics as the academic area most pertinent to public policy. As Charles W. Eliot, the Gilded Age president of Harvard, put it was modern history, not ancient, that was, quote, so useful to a legislator, administrator, journalist, publicist, philanthropist, or philosopher, end quote. The prevailing historiographical narrative, then, is that by the end of the 19th century, women could acquire a high-caliber education in classics, but this would be of no use to them should they wish to secure entry into public life. While it is true that many of Yale's first women classicists did not deploy their classical knowledge to become career politicians, they were nonetheless deeply committed to activist causes, and their training in classics manifestly influenced the strategies they devised to promote these. An ancillary objective of this project is therefore to offer a corrective to this narrative, which perpetuates the myth that it was exclusively classically trained men who shaped the world around them. A well-known example of a woman from this time period who wielded her classical education to improve concretely the lives of others is Jane Addams. As a 10-year-old, Addams customarily rose at 3 a.m. to read Pope's translation of the Iliad and Dryden's translation of the Aeneid, and was paid 5 cents by her father for each of Plutarch's lives that she finished. After studying Latin and Greek at Rockford Seminary, Addams would ensure that Hull House offered classes in Latin and Greek, as well as classical civilization courses taught by various luminaries from the nearby University of Chicago. For Addams, as for Yale's first women classicists, the study of the classics and the betterment of the wider world were inextricably bound up with one another. The types of activism with which the women in my study engaged were many and various. Some, like Jane Addams, devoted themselves to progressive causes that took them beyond the confines of the academy. After serving as professor of Greek at the University of Denver for 9 years, Gertrude Harper Beggs, Yale Ph.D. 1904, became dean of the Chicago Kindergarten Institute, a social settlement founded in collaboration with the University of Chicago that aimed to teach women how to teach kindergarten in immigrant communities. Maud Thompson, Ph.D. 1906, likewise led a life that seamlessly combined teaching with reform activism. From as early as her undergraduate years at Wellesley, where she founded the Agora, a political debate society that exists to this day, Thompson dedicated herself to organizing the communities of which she was part. It seems likely that her student activism at Wellesley influenced the dissertation that she would go on to write at Yale, entitled On the Property Rights of Women in Ancient Greece. Her first job upon graduating from Yale was a lectureship on suffrage and socialism at Detroit Seminary. Thereafter, she accepted a teaching position at the School of Organic Education in Fairhope, Alabama, where tests and grades were forbidden and students were not assigned homework until high school. Thompson taught handcrafts and folk dancing alongside more traditional subjects, and the school eventually attracted the attention of the educational reformer John Dewey, who wrote a favorable review of it in his 1915 book Schools of Tomorrow. After leaving Fairhope, Thompson moved back east to teach classics at a string of secondary schools in the New York suburbs. While employed at Miss Beard's School in Orange, New Jersey, she played a pivotal role in organizing the 5-month-long Patterson Silk Strike of 1913, which involved demands for an 8-hour workday and improved working conditions. Towards the end of her life, Thompson devoted herself once more to the cause of progressive education. She joined the faculty of the High Mowing School in New Hampshire, the oldest Waldorf school in the United States. Beulah Emmett, the school's founder, paid her the following tribute in her book, From Farm to School. The doyen of the group was Dr. Maud Thompson, a veteran teacher with an amazing memory and a Ph.D. from Yale. She was a little white-haired woman, her hair soft and fluffy, her eyes clear, direct, and wise, even when they twinkled. She lived in the village and used to invite students to meals. They came back, wide-eyed, because she had shed the teacher for the hostess, cooked a delicious meal, and turned on all her charm. She was liberal in spite of her cameo, a socialist with all the strength of her convictions. When she saw things to be done, she did them quietly and definitely, a tower of strength. As Emmett's remarks make plain, Thompson's socialism was inseparable from, and indeed enriched, her career as a teacher. Other women in this fascinating group took action to reform the world around them without ever leaving the hallowed halls of the academy. As Barbara Solomon has demonstrated, women professors in the first decades of the 20th century were instrumental, despite their minority status in the professoriate, in replacing the dull recitation training of the early 19th century classroom with lively seminars and lectures modeled after those in German universities. The innovations of Irene Nye certainly lend support to her thesis. In 1915, Nye became a professor of Greek and Latin at Connecticut College and worked there until her retirement. An early champion of democracy in campus life, she encouraged student government in nearly all university matters, including the design of her own courses. In collaboration with her students, she implemented Connecticut College's first classical civilization course, which placed an emphasis on classical reception avant la lettre. After an endeavor to understand the real value of these old tragedies, she wrote in an article in the Classical Outlook, we decided to turn to O'Neill's Morning Becomes Electra, Jean Baudin's Oreste, Robert Turney's Daughters of Atreus, and finally to the Electra of Jean Giraudoux. Nye took pains, moreover, to ensure that her curriculum incorporated contemporary works by women and minorities, such as the translations of Euripides' Medea by Edith Hamilton and County Cullen. When she retired, President Blunt recommended to the Board of Trustees that she be granted a supplementary allowance. The classical civilization courses launched by Barbara Phillipa McCarthy and Margaret Elizabeth Taylor at Wellesley, entitled Hellenic Heritage and Interpretations of Men in Western Literature, also deserve mention, as do the interdisciplinary courses on classical texts and numismatics that Elizabeth Hatch Palmer offered at Vassar. Most of the women in my study did not publish prodigiously, but rather channeled their scholarly energies into producing materials designed to improve the welfare of their students. A passage from Amy Louise Barbour's Sabbatical application form at Smith expresses well this state of affairs. Quote, I am not prepared at this moment to indicate a special piece of work that I should plan to do, but I hope to make use of the opportunity to revisit classical sites in Greece, Sicily, and Italy, and also go to Egypt, my interest in which has been greatly enhanced by the work I have been doing on an edition of Herodotus, which has occupied me for several years, and which I hope will be out next fall. The results of such a trip may not be embodied in any published work, but I am sure they will mean a mental and spiritual refreshment, which I hope will be apparent in my work. A request for university funding to travel to unspecified locations for the purpose of mental and spiritual refreshment with a view to improving a student textbook would be utterly unthinkable today, and yet the value of Barbour's edition of Herodotus is self-evident. As one reviewer put it, Barbour's edition offered an alternative to textbooks that provided students with, quote, either an unabridged selection of the most distinctly historical matter, or simply a collection of Herodotus' best stories, without any context, either the pudding without the plums, or the plums without the pudding, end quote. In a similar vein, Louise Preston Dodge co-published with her aunt, Harriet Waters Preston, a textbook entitled The Private Lives of the Romans, which, in the words of reviewer Professor Charles Bennett of Cornell, was one of the first school books to, quote, emphasize the humanistic as opposed to the formal side of classical studies, end quote. The last form of social protest I would like to address in this podcast is one peculiar to the time period in which these women lived, the 19th century women's novel, a genre frequently deployed to resist the Victorian conception of the feminine ideal. In 1888, 2 years before she embarked upon her Ph.D. in classics at Yale, Louise Preston Dodge co-published with her aunt a novel entitled The Guardians, which offers a shrewd analysis of the deficiencies in the education of young women. The basic premise of the novel is this. 2 orphan sisters, Constance and Ruth, who have inherited a great deal of wealth, are placed under the guardianship of Amory Rothery, a spurned lover of their mother's. Ruth, the elder sister, is portrayed as saintly and self-renouncing, while Constance is of a more tempestuous and romantic persuasion. Eventually, Amory goes off to fight in the Civil War, and the 2 sisters are left to suffer the consequences of the education with which he has provided them. Rather than sending the sisters off to school, as his sister, the eminently practical Jane Rothery, suggests, Amory insists that they be educated at home. Amory had a fastidious dislike of all girls' schools, the novel reads, and Mrs. Rothery would, on every account, very much have preferred a school, if one might then have been found capable of furnishing a sufficiently thorough, solid, and strengthening course. And if there is no such school in Boston, said Jane, where is there one? As it happens, the education for which Mrs. Rothery advocates closely resembles that which Louise Preston Dodge would have received at the Girls' Latin School in Boston, which was founded in 1878 by William Fairfield Warren, the president of Boston University, the first college in Massachusetts to hire women professors. Amory, however, vetoes Mrs. Rothery's suggestions in no uncertain terms. "Oh," said he with flute-like mildness, "I never have any doubt about it. My girls shall learn whatever wise women think they ought to learn, but they are not going to school." The education Amory imposes upon the sisters imparts to them nothing of any practical value. Their dim-witted governess Hannah Shippen sums up their studies as follows. Ruth reads her French and writes her poetry and plays the piano. And Connie draws. I'd just like you to see the things she draws. Without any formal education to curb their innate dispositions, the sisters become characters of themselves, which in turn leads to romantic entanglement and blind folly. The novel's epigraph, taken from the Gospel according to Matthew, "Tuflos to tuflonean hodege," if a blind man leads a blind man, succinctly captures the nature of the sisters' upbringing while riveting attention to its alternative, the classical training enjoyed by Dodge and Preston. The approach taken by Dodge and Preston in The Guardians begs comparison with that taken by 2 other 19th century women novelists, Elizabeth Stuart Phelps and George Eliot, both of whom availed themselves of their knowledge of the classical past to argue for the educational advancement of women. As Caroline Winterer has shown, these 2 authors enlist the figure of Antigone to embody the educational trajectory available to 19th century women. In Phelps's short story, The Sacrifice of Antigone, the indigent Dorothea Dreed, whom we are to read as Antigone, manages to scrape together enough money by working 2 menial jobs to finance her studies at a coeducational college. After much blood, sweat, and tears, she masters her lessons and recites in Greek at a competition with 4 young men. As one might expect, Dorothea wins the competition, but dies shortly thereafter from sheer exhaustion. George Eliot, who was a correspondent of Phelps and from whose novels Dodge and Preston quote in The Guardians, refers to the heroine of Middlemarch as, quote, a sort of Christian Antigone, end quote, and presents her as struggling to find educational fulfillment, especially with respect to Greek and Latin. In the light of this literary historical context, it is difficult not to read The Guardians through the lens of Antigone. The novel's premise, 2 sisters placed under the protection of a deeply flawed male guardian, recalls the triangular relationship of Creon, Antigone, and Ismene in Sophocles' tragedy. Last but not least, I would like to say a word or two about the demographic profiles of the first women classicists of Yale. Of the 13 women who obtained their PhDs between 1894 and 1920, 8 had the privilege to attend elite all-women's colleges such as Wellesley, Smith, and Vassar. A typical example of this demographic might be Elizabeth Frances Abbe, whose blue-blooded Puritan ancestry a diligent employee of the Yale Alumni Office has taken the time to map out in a family tree on the back of her file. Elizabeth Hatch Palmer, the daughter of a physician from Ipswich, Massachusetts, who inculcated in her a love of collecting Greek and Roman coins, came from a similarly white, affluent, and Protestant background. Not all of the women in my study, however, hailed from such patrician circumstances. The remaining 5 classicists in this time period attended colleges as diverse as Upper Iowa University, Washburn College, Kansas State University, and the University of Nebraska. Although she attended Yale after these women, it is worth mentioning that Barbara Phillipa McCarthy grew up in a working-class Irish family in Providence, Rhode Island, where she attended the academically rigorous classical high school. One of the few Catholics in this group of women classicists, a fact I have ascertained from the Yale alumni files which record the various churches frequented by Yale alumni, McCarthy faced an immense amount of anti-Catholic discrimination. Her response to a trustee asking how she was doing, "I'm having trouble with me verbs in my elementary Greek class," caused him to become worried that the young ladies of Wellesley College were being taught by a professor who still spoke like an Irishwoman. The steep cost of attending graduate school as a woman at the turn of the 20th century meant that almost all of the women in my study applied for external teaching positions at local high schools while at Yale. I have included in my slideshow 2 applications by Louise Preston Dodge, Ph.D. 1900, partially to demonstrate the absurdity of the criteria by which these women were evaluated for these positions, and partially because Dodge clearly had an excellent sense of humor. In addition to asking applicants to which churches they belong, the questionnaire asks them to specify, quote, if they have given any attention to athletics, end quote. Dodge's response, no, accounts for my perfect health. To the prompt, what is the published grade of your scholarship? A cruel and pointless question to ask any graduate student. Dodge writes simply, I don't understand. Under references, she states, Dean Phillips is the only Yale man who gave me permission to refer to him. On the back of these forms, there is a slot for the evaluator to describe the applicant's person and manner. Of Irma Eloise Cole, Professor Thomas Dwight Goodall writes, agreeable and striking in a way, slender, but evidently able to do hard work. Sadly, it was not only the Yale faculty who made physical appearance a criterion for ostensibly merit-based scholarships. The correspondence between Edward Capps of Princeton, the chairman of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens Managing Committee, to Samuel Bassett of the University of Vermont, who headed the committee that selected the school's fellows, reveals a chilling degree of sexism directed towards Barbara McCarthy. Those who have taught Miss McCarthy, Capps writes, speak well of her intelligence, but she is queer-looking. Another consequence of the limited amount of scholarship money awarded to female graduate students was that many of Yale's first women classicists had to teach for a number of years before starting their PhDs. Margaret Elizabeth Taylor taught Latin in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho for 2 years before starting her doctorate, while Elizabeth Hatch Palmer served as an instructor of Latin at Wheaton Seminary, now Wheaton College, for 10. According to Barbara Solomon, this strategy for shouldering the cost of tuition manifested itself even at the undergraduate level, causing the average age of the student population to be much higher than that of our own day. At Radcliffe College, the average age of women graduates between 1890 and 1900 was 29. The difficulty of paying for graduate school if one was a woman in the 1890s may account, in part, for the scanty representation of women in the first coeducational graduate student cohorts in the Yale Classics department. When Susan Dinsmore, too, became the first woman to receive a Ph.D. in classics from Yale in 1895, she was the only woman in a cohort of 5 people. In the 4 years that followed, no women were to follow her example. Gradually, the ratio of female to male graduate students improved, although it never reached an equilibrium in the period covered by this study. Barbara Solomon estimates that in 1900 only 6% of graduate students in the United States were women, but by 1911 this figure had risen to 11%. It is perhaps unsurprising, given the financial and emotional cost of obtaining a Ph.D. at the turn of the century, that, with the exception of Maud Thompson, none of the women in my study married. In her 1881 commencement address at Rockford Seminary, Jane Addams airs the view that one was either a mother or an educated woman, and never the twain shall meet. Quote, "Let a woman not sit and dreamily watch her child. Let her work her way to a sentient idea that shall sway and ennoble those around her. All that subtle force among women that is now dream fancy might be changed into creative genius." End quote. Indeed, the alumni records for Yale's first women classicists are littered with letters addressed to siblings, cousins, and friends, soliciting information to include in their obituaries, but almost none to children or spouses. This is not to say that these women did not enjoy meaningful, long-lasting partnerships. Amy Louise Barbour, who taught ancient Greek at Smith, shared a home in Lancaster, Massachusetts with one Florence Gagg, with whom she adopted 2 children from Smyrna. Margaret Elizabeth Taylor maintained a lifelong relationship with Catherine Balderston, a distinguished professor in the Wellesley English department, and retired with her to an assisted living facility outside of Philadelphia. Nonetheless, there can be little doubt that these women's choice to undertake doctoral work at Yale had a profound impact on their personal lives, which not infrequently entailed a great deal of self-sacrifice. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast on Yale's first women classicists. This broadcast is part of an ongoing exploration of American women classical scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the next phase of which will likely take the form of a story map created using ArcGIS software. Please stay tuned for more details, and thank you very much for listening.